Well, I'm sitting next to Marvin Odum, who is the president and CEO of Shell Oil Company. He's a third generation in the oil patch. You can tell us more about your background, but he's in charge of not only oil and gas in the U.S., but the whole Western Hemisphere. So he's a fairly important person in this industry, I think we can say. And I have to ask you a question, I'd kill myself if I didn't ask you this. So when I'm driving down the road and I see like a Shell gas station on my right and like an Exxon on the left, does it matter which one I buy? I mean, is Shell gasoline the same gasoline as the other stuff?
No, absolutely not. I mean,
it's actually better?
Surely you know the answer to this question. Huh? This is one of those cases where you can let the numbers speak for themselves, because I think Shell is not just the largest marketer of gasoline in the U.S., but I think in the world as well.
What do you drive?
Well, my wife and I just got a new car. It's an Audi A7, which is a really fantastic, beautiful car.
When was the last time you ran out of gas? Remember the old days, people just would run out of gas a lot?
Yeah, I was 16.
You were 16?
I remember it very well, yeah.
Wow.
I was
That's not going to happen
late
again,
to school, yeah.
You could call in a chopper to bring it in if that happened again. I want to ask you about something that yesterday, if those of us who were in this session, in this very room yesterday morning, Dennis Dimmick had this incredible slideshow about large planetary challenges. And one of the things that a quote he put on the slideshow was from Daniel Nocera, a researcher a scientist, who says that every year we burn through 1 million years of ancient photosynthesis in the form of fossil fuels that we've drilled or extracted or mined. And Dennis's larger point is that we had to switch from this system of using ancient photosynthesis in the form of these hydrocarbons to using present photosynthesis and solar energy and current sunlight. So let me just ask you, I mean, from your perspective, does it make sense for us as a civilization to be so aggressively drilling in so many different ponds around the world, from the Arctic to the Gulf to wherever, and extracting so many of these fossil fuels and burning them? Does that make sense? And if we're going to switch to a renewable energy type of scenario, how long would that take?
Well, that's a huge question.
I'm sorry,
which is great. I mean, we're happy just to kind of break into it, but there's 5 or 6 different important paths you could probably follow there. I think I have to start back with the very fundamentals of just where we are today in terms of energy and where the world's going. And we're going to come back to this on the stress nexus piece, but I'm sure you've heard lots of conversation this week and in years past about the world growing to 9 billion people. So the very, very short story of that is energy demand between now and the middle of this century will be twice what it is today. So if you imagine the scale of the energy system, which is beyond imagination, I think, unless you've really dived into this business, it is hard to get your arms around how big it actually is and how much investment it takes to make it work.
And just so I'm clear, it's not just the growth in population, it's that the people who are already here are going to want more energy day to day.
7 billion people today. Somewhere between 1 and 1.5 of those have no access to energy at all. So you've got that 1.5 billion moving towards some access to energy. You've got growing middle classes, you have emerging economies, and you're going to add 2 billion new people. And so let me jump ahead to something I was going to say later, and that is the way I internalize what 2 billion new people in the world looks like, because I think of energy use in terms of cities and what they look like and what cars and movement looks like. Growing to 9 billion people by 2050 is the equivalent of a new city of 1 million people every week for the next 30 years. So just imagine the energy growth associated with that kind of expansion.
I know you want to go on with this, but is this all baked in the cake already? In other words, the trajectory of population, the amount of energy demand, I mean, is there a way to bend that curve a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a lot of variation in the curve. So what Shell does is we project these 50-year type scenarios of where the world may go and what are the options that the world can choose from. And those break down both energy growth and what sort of efficiency assumptions you can build into that. So when I say 2 times the amount of energy by 2050, that assumes enormous increases in energy efficiency beyond what we've seen anywhere in the past. So that's already baked into that kind of number.
So
It also-
it's an optimistic number, actually.
Most people would, when you really look at the numbers, they'd say that's an optimistic number. The other reason why a lot of people would tell you it's optimistic is Shell's current set of scenarios basically say that we could get to as much as 30% of the energy supply via renewables by the middle of the century. Now that would be growth in an energy form that we've never even come close to that in the history of the world. We went back and looked at history. History doesn't necessarily have to predict the future, but we looked at the history, and as new energy sources have come into play, it has taken, historically, 30 years for that new source to get to 1% of the energy supply. Now, government policy and other things, technology breakthroughs can help to accelerate that, but we've got to remember that's where we're coming from.
So you're saying by 2050, 30% of the energy supply will be renewable. So 70% is still fossil fuel.
It's still something else, right? It's something else. Now, it could be new technologies, could be nuclear, could be fossil fuel. So it's something else.
Maybe this is a dumb question, but does Shell institutionally, and do you personally, do you want to see this transition to renewable energy, or does that start to impinge upon Shell's, bottom line and its strategic goals?
If you think about the way we run a company, we look at our current business and we run a day-to-day huge business. I mean, we invest $30 billion in new projects every year. So this is an enormous company, and there's a lot to do to just deliver energy for tomorrow to a world that really needs it. But when we're sitting in with our executive committee that runs all the businesses around the world and sets the strategy for where Shell goes in the future, we talk about 2025, 2035, 2050 in terms of what's possible out there. Where are the discontinuities in terms of technology? Where might they come up? And it makes perfect sense for us to be talking about that because, we're looking at how do we make this we're already 100 years old, another 100-year sustainable sort of company. So I won't say we're agnostic to it.
So you have a 100-year horizon.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the projects we put in place are 20 to 40-year life projects. So the money we're spending today, we already have to think in that time scale. But let me just say, in terms of energy source, other than getting what there is to get out of today's businesses, our view in the long term has to be sort of an agnostic view of what the energy source is. We have to look at that and say what's possible, what technology breakthroughs might be there, how do we play in those technology breakthroughs, how do we create them in some cases, and then how do we build a sustainable business around that? Which is why you see a company like Shell shifting from oil to natural gas now, because we think over the next couple of decades, if you look at environmental improvement and other aspects of energy supply at an affordable price, we think the next couple of decades will be dominated by natural gas.
When you say you're shifting from oil to natural gas, what do you mean by that? I mean, that literally natural gas is going to become the majority of your business?
Yeah, so for the first time ever in 2012, Shell will produce more natural gas than it does oil on an energy equivalent basis, by choice. That's because for years now, we've been exploring for that resource and now we're producing it.
That's you're talking globally, or are you talking about here in the U.S.?
That's globally.
Here in the U.S., how has the administration's policies helped, hindered, enabled the boom in natural gas exploration and production? And for example, the rules on fracking, is that giving you a regulatory framework that you're able to work within, or are you all feeling like you're being hampered, you're pressured by the government?
No, well, let me describe it this way, and some of you may have been in the room last year and heard there was something we rolled out actually at the Ideas Festival last year, and that was what we called the 5 principles for onshore development, to develop this onshore gas. And it specifically addressed both, how you build and operate these the wells to produce this resource, how you deal with the water issues to protect water and minimize water usage, how you minimize emissions, how you minimize your footprint, and how you work with communities. And the reason why we did that was not to say, here's the way, well, it was a little bit, I guess, to say here's the way Shell thinks it ought to be done, but the principle behind it was to set the standard in the industry for how it ought to be done, and ultimately to see that reflected in the regulations. So we want to see those principles actually into the regulations, which in most cases would raise the regulatory level from where they are today. And we want to see enforcement of those regulations to make sure all 7,000 operators that are producing natural gas in the U.S. are following those standards.
So is it the federal government who sets the standards or the states?
Primarily the states.
And are they doing it in a rational way? Would you prefer the federal government to do it so you had one standard everywhere?
Yeah, so this is, I have to be careful on this one because I'm on both sides of this equation. I think it's worth a minute to explain what I mean. When it comes to regulations around things like standards for gasoline, it doesn't make sense to have a different standard in every state. Right. It's very inefficient, it's very expensive, it increases your price of fuel and so forth. In that kind of case, a federal standard makes sense. In the case of natural gas development onshore, you're dealing with water issues, particular topographies, with particular geologies in various states. And actually, it's the regulatory bodies in those states that know those particulars the best. So it's a little bit where we've evolved to, but I think it's fair to say at this point, you're better off having the states who know exactly what they're dealing with regulate. But that needs some help, and that's what the principles were all about.
And is that the current situation out there, or is it going towards more of a federal standard?
Yeah, no, it's pretty much, no, that's pretty much the case. I mean, the states have had primacy over water issues and so forth for, maybe since the beginning of the U.S. And there's always been an argument about where it belongs. I have no problem with regulations being set at a federal level if they truly are blanket applicable to everywhere, if they don't need to be adjusted for a particular location.
Can the U.S. become energy independent?
Well, I think more so now than ever before. So that's the one thing it is a maybe. Well, I think it's a maybe because there's a couple of big questions in getting to that answer. But if you look at the amount of natural gas that's been found in North America, let's say, and maybe let me ask you, would you allow me to say energy independent basically means in North America as opposed to just a U.S.? So if you take
I'll allow you to do whatever you want to do,
so
Marvin.
if you take North America as your energy supply, you can actually make a case that you could get to a point of being energy independent. Now, I'm not sure that's where we want to go or that that's what makes the most economic sense or so forth.
But why not? Why would we not?
Because we may find that there are resources from other countries that are easily accessible, that are secure, that we still want to take advantage of because maybe that lowers the overall cost of energy. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. But in terms of shifting from where we've been in the past and where we are today, of not being happy necessarily with where our energy comes from, and having a national policy and a mindset that says, we want to do two things. First of all, we're going to use this much oil and gas over the next couple of decades, no matter what we do or what we decide in terms of the long-term energy mix. So let's produce that at home rather than produce it somewhere else. And we could do that if we wanted to do that. The other part of that policy has to be, where do we want to go with the long-term energy mix? How do we ensure technology investment into technology around renewables and other sources of energy so that we're ready for the next stage?
Now, you export liquid natural gas, correct?
Well, all over the world we do, but not out of the U.S. So this is one of the sort of the current questions of government policy is, will we be in a position and will the U.S. want to export liquefied natural gas?
What's Shell's position on that?
So we think it makes sense to do so, and not in a big way. And let me just lay out the sort of the parameters behind it. There's so much natural gas that's been found in North America that there's plenty of resource there to support both supplying the domestic market and a very much a growing domestic market as well as an export market. And if you look at the numbers, you would even say, I would say, and I think you would find that you can export a fairly significant amount. I don't want to talk in technical terms because I don't know how much sense that would make to everyone, but on the order of 20 million tons per annum. It's a lot of
20 million
tons? Million tons per annum of liquefied natural gas. So it's a lot of natural gas. You could export at a level like that without impacting in any significant way the price of natural gas in the U.S. So the question comes down to, in the end, are we a free market society? We have free trade agreements with a lot of different companies, and are we going to treat energy different than we treat other elements in our market agreements? Which is a slippery slope to a degree if we start doing that. We're complaining about other countries doing that now, of course, with minerals and such things.
Wait, so Shell's position, though, is that we are a free market and that the market should determine the amount of natural gas that would be exported, and
Yeah.
not a government policy
Well,
from on high that says, no, you can't do 20 million tons, you can only do 5 million tons.
No, actually, so I personally believe there is a government overlay on this that says, what is our energy policy, and what do LNG exports, how does that impact this policy? And I think in that context of a country that wants to be largely self-supplied and wants secure supplies of energy, the answer is still going to be a certain amount of exports will make sense. And when you export that, what you get then as a country is you get a trade balance, which has been incredibly negative for the U.S. for a number of years as we've imported all this energy into the country. You get a trade balance benefit, which strengthens our economy. You get the jobs and the domestic investment and so forth and the infrastructure required to do that. So those are some of the benefits.
Aren't people going to object, though, just at the thought that, you know, we're sending these drilling rigs out to western Pennsylvania and drilling this stuff, and then we're piping it down to the Chesapeake Bay and shipping it off? Won't people say that doesn't make sense?
Well, if you're in Japan, you'd say it makes perfect sense because that's where their energy has come from for the last 20, 25 years. And they're actually talking to the U.S. about, you know, we trust the U.S. The U.S. would be a very secure market for us. The Japanese are very much advocating for, can you take some of this gas and actually send it to us? So it does, from a market fundamentals pricing standpoint, it all makes sense. It happens all over the world already. Right. It will absolutely happen out of Canada. Right. Think about, you know, this huge basket of resources that are now in North America. Those that set up in Western Canada are the furthest away from the markets. So they're at the wrong end of a very much oversupplied pipeline, if you will, and it's going to make sense for that gas to get exported to Asia, and that's you know, there's a 90% chance that's what will happen.
Just so I know, the tar sands, obviously an enormously controversial topic for environmental reasons. What's Shell's position on whether it makes sense to use those resources, given that the environmentalists say that's going to contribute to anthropogenic global warming?
Yeah, so we're in the oil sands. We do produce, you know, on the order of 250,000 barrels a day. It's already a very important strategic, secure energy resource for the U.S. So that we're already at that point. I think the question for us as a company, and the question that we address every day with socially responsible investors and people that just care about this subject, is what is the real impact of an oil sands operation and what are you doing to improve it? So the first thing you have to keep in mind is none of this is static. You know, all of this can be improved and all this is being improved. So the primary complaint about oil sands to date has been around CO2 emissions. This is a high CO2 intensity way to produce oil to turn it into fuel. We've done the numbers, you know, external consultants have done the numbers, not associated with us, and the independent view is that this oil is about 5 to 15%, depending on whose project you are, 5 to 15% more CO2 intensive than just your average oil production anywhere in the world. So it's not double or triple or quadruple, it's 5 to 15% more. And then we're working now with the government of Canada to install the first carbon capture and storage project ever, which will take about 25% of the CO2 that is emitted from our operations and actually store it permanently underground. So I think it's a good example of working an innovative partnership with the government to try to figure out how to progress this in a way that improves the environmental performance.
And I want to get to the stress nexus in a minute, but just so I know, does Shell have a position in general on climate change and the role of fossil fuels in driving it?
Yes. So the position is pretty straightforward. Climate change, yes. Something we have to be concerned about, yes. Something we have to plan for as a company because it is going to be dealt with ultimately by governments and society and so forth. Yes, that's the way we build our business. We've taken it to the standpoint of saying internally, so if you're bringing a project to me to invest, you know, $10 billion in building something, then the economics that you show me on that project are going to include a charge of $40 a ton for CO2. Now, the global price for CO2 in countries that are regulating it right now is about $10 probably on average, $10 to $15. So we're already charging ourselves $40 a ton because our assumption is this is going to happen. This does need to happen. We've advocated very hard for a carbon price and a framework that, as many regions and countries as you can involve, the better. But even on a country level, we've advocated very hard for, in our case, a cap and trade system in the US. We supported AB 32 in California. So, that's a whole lot of words to say. Yeah, it's a simple position for us.
Does it matter to y'all who wins the election this fall?
Yeah, well, I mean, it may matter on a personal level, but from a business level, the answer is no. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but, the simple perspective we take in working, let's use the US government as an example, but it's the same all over the world, is whoever's there, that's who you're going to be working with. And so we don't work issues in a partisan way because of who's there at the time. So, you raised oil sands, that's controversial. The other thing we'll likely be doing in Alaska this summer is drilling offshore Alaska, which is equally, if not more, controversial. Now, we've done that working with the Obama administration to walk through a very long process of determining, with the potential benefits to the country, is this the right thing to do? So I can pretty clearly, some things may be easier with one winner or the other, but from the perspective of the company, it shouldn't and it can't matter.
So this summer, as I understand it, the rig is on the way to, what is it, the Chukchi?
And the Beaufort.
And the Beaufort. So they'll be drilling in both places this summer?
There'll be 2 rigs, and they're 2 rigs for specific reason. One of the first early thoughts in Alaska was just go with 1 rig because it minimizes the noise and the impact and so forth. The final decision between us and the government was go for 2 rigs, drill in both seas at the same time, so that if you need 1 rig to back up the other, you have 2 in the area and ready to go.
How would 1 rig back up the other?
These rigs are equipped in a 100% redundant fashion. So everything it takes to drill a well is on each rig twice.
Okay.
So if for some reason you had difficulty with a rig and you had an emergency situation, you had to react, you just bring in a new rig.
You could drill a relief well.
It could actually, you could drill a relief well, or it could actually leave everything that it was using to drill in the Beaufort and move to the Chukchi with all redundant equipment already on the ship, ready to go.
Whose rigs are these?
Well, one rig is ours, and the other rig is contract. Most rigs in the world are contracted from drilling contractors. This is Noble.
Okay. I mean, since we're on the topic, are you concerned at all that, I mean, I wrote a book on the Gulf oil spill.
Yeah.
The Arctic is a different environment, much fewer resources to deploy if you had a spill. I mean, would you be ready to handle an emergency like the one that happened in the Gulf?
Yeah, and I think the piece that I hope makes sense is we shouldn't allow ourselves as a company to do it if we couldn't respond, because a problem that you couldn't deal with would be enough to destroy a company like Shell, just like it almost destroyed a company in the Gulf of Mexico. And I don't think we'd be getting permission from the government and all the stakeholders that have to allow us to go do this if they weren't convinced now that we had the plans and the equipment to deal with any of the emergencies we could encounter. I think, particularly because you're so knowledgeable about what happened in the Gulf of Mexico, one of the things that's different about drilling in the Arctic is that it's incredibly remote and it's incredibly pristine. So there is nothing around at all. And the implications for that in terms of drilling in the Arctic is you don't have plans in place such that if you have a problem, you call out resources from various parts of the world. You take everything with you to begin with. So along with the government, we've estimated what's called a worst case scenario. We've identified all of the equipment and response to be able to respond to that within a 1-hour notice. And all of that equipment is mandated to be on site in the Arctic while we're drilling. It's completely different than anything you've seen.
What's the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is an uncontrolled well that has a spill rate that's calculated based on the pressures and the type of reservoirs that we're dealing with. And this is another reason why it's very different than the Gulf of Mexico. And then it's the ability to go in and capture that oil if it's spilling and cap a well with the equipment that's already been pre-prepared. And if you have difficulty capping it, be able to contain it and put it in a barge at the surface. So contrary to what you saw in the Gulf of Mexico, the big difference is we're in 150 feet of water or less.
Right.
So you can actually get divers to the equipment on the sea floor. And we're dealing with what's called normal pressures or low pressures, not high flow rates and not high pressures.
I mean, God forbid that would ever happen, but in the Gulf, you know, you had the Deepwater Horizon. When it sank, it landed about 1,500 feet away from the wellhead. And obviously, they eventually went in and cut the riser pipe, and they dropped this 3-ramp capping stack that was sort of an off-the-shelf piece of technology, and they were able to then to shut in the well. What would you do if you had a situation where a rig collapsed on a blown-out well?
Yeah.
So that you have not only the blowout and the flow, but you've got now a damaged rig sitting on top of it.
Yeah. A couple elements to that. One is you have to have the ability to move that off. So that's part of the, you know, there's several custom-built ships that will be out there that were built strictly for this operation. So you have to be able to move that. And the other thing to picture in a drilling operation different than what you've seen in the Gulf is everything is buried below the sea floor. So if you can remove that debris, your wellhead, your BOP, it sits below the seafloor, so it's not entangled and so forth.
So the BOP is not sitting on the seafloor?
Well, it is, but what we do is we dig a trench, basically, and put this all down further. Now, it helps in a situation like what you're talking about. The other concept for us is if for any reason you needed to leave that equipment there over the wintertime, then you have ice move back into the area. You get what's called ice scour. You know, ice will come along and basically just, you know, scratch along the sea floor. Well, then we wanted all this buried deep enough to where none of that could be impacted by ice scouring.
Well,
so it's a very different mechanical setup.
It sounds like a very difficult and technologically challenging place to drill. Is it harder to do that there than it is, say, in the Gulf or some other place?
This is I'm getting ready to say something that I'm always very cautious about saying, because let me go back to what I said before, which is this is very remote and very pristine, and it needs to be treated as such. The idea of drilling wells in 150 feet of water to 12,000 feet deep at normal pressures is some of the easiest work that we do in the industry anywhere in the world. I mean, it's just not, from a technical standpoint, drilling the wells is not the hard part. Being prepared for anything in a remote, pristine environment is the challenge, and that's where the real work is taking place.
Let's go talk about the stress nexus issue that we had chatted about earlier, and we'll go to questions pretty soon. But tell us about this idea that you and some of your colleagues have been thinking about with food, water, energy kind of converging into a set of overlapping problems in the future.
So the simple concept here, very complicated to do anything about it, but the simple concept is the way we described with energy, with global population growing the way it is, energy demand growing the way it will grow, that creates stress, not only finding enough energy, and there's debate over whether or not there will even be enough energy to double what we supply today. But then can you do that in a way that the environmental stresses don't get so challenging that they have to put a stop to the program? So that's just the energy line alone is very challenging. And then you look at the fundamentals behind what's driving that energy challenge, and it's exactly the same for food, and it's exactly the same for water. Growing population, huge demand increases, certain parts of the world that don't have things that they need. And then when you just take one step deeper into it, what you find is food, water, and energy are inextricably linked. And because it takes energy to make food, it takes water to make food, it takes energy to clean water and move water and desalinate water in parts of the world, and you can go on and on and on. And we find that you can't actually separate these two. And while we've been treating these stresses and these plans and talked about energy mix and the change into the future in sort of this singular fashion of how do we reduce CO2 and so forth, what we find is it's not that easy. I mean, you could go to a country and you could reduce CO2 emissions from transport fuels by 90% by going to a biofuel solution. But if you're in a country where you have to irrigate to produce the plant life that creates the biofuels, that's not going to lead you to a solution that you like. And so what we're finding is we actually have to work all of these elements concurrently.
Do you feel that your industry needs to speak up more to drive that conversation, particularly when it comes to things like biofuels, to remind people that some of this stuff is not as environmentally benign as it might be marketed as?
So that's exactly what this is about. So I think not only do we have a responsibility to, but this is an opportunity. Again, I'll turn it to the inside of the company. This is an opportunity to lead in this space and to be very vocal in this space. So we have, and so let's talk about biofuels, for example. We have entered into the biofuel space, and what we're doing is we've started about a $12 billion, this is a big investment, about a $12 billion joint venture in Brazil, producing about 2 billion liters of biofuel a year from sugarcane. And the reason why we looked all over the world and why we decided to go to Brazil and why we decided to start there and then add technology to see, can we get to even further advances in biofuels, is because it doesn't take land that would be otherwise needed for food, and because it uses rainwater, not irrigation, to produce.
But they're not clearing rainforest to grow sugarcane, are they?
No, not at all. So this is all existing land. This is, and actually, we wouldn't have entered the business if this meant clearing the rainforest, right, or moving into the Amazon. It's exactly the kind of consideration that we have to have going into it. But it goes all the way back to where does it get its water? And is there sufficient water there in a natural sense to do that?
Do you feel that right now we have the political institutions and structures to address this kind of a challenge, food, water, energy in the future? Or are we stumbling and bumbling along and not getting it done?
Yeah, well, so I think everybody knows we're stumbling like crazy on even things as simple as just having an energy policy, but we're stumbling all over the place. And we've described it in terms of this triangle of business, government, and society, and we say this triangle is broken now. It's broken in each element, actually. Each relationship is not working the way it should.
Well, explain that. How is business, I think we'll stipulate that government is broken, because we had panels on that yesterday, right? So that's done, okay.
Yeah.
How is business broken? How is society broken?
So it's the relationships between the two that are broken. So let's just take, this is a worldwide discussion, but let's take the US as a microcosm of the world. And you look at the relationship between business and government, and it's a pretty adversarial relationship. Now, we in government and everybody else works to not make it that way. I know there's good actors in every scenario, but it's a pretty adversarial relationship, a pretty low trust relationship. I think if you take society and if you take NGOs as a representative of that, the relationship between business and NGOs is not particularly good. And again, in the US, now the relationship between NGOs and governments is not particularly good because of inaction and so forth. So it's just recognizing that piece is not working. So what can we do about it? Because the energy piece alone is plenty challenging. You kind of ask, why would we step into this bigger piece and try to do something about it? But it comes from a core belief that you can actually get, some very large companies, not just energy companies, I'm talking about, all across the entire spectrum of sectors of business, IT, urban planning companies, everything you can think of, together to work some of these projects around the world, like the development of new cities and so forth, from an energy, from a water, from a food, from a sustainability standpoint, design these, work on projects to actually get them on the ground where people can see them and become a template for something that can be used in the broader sense across the globe. That's the concept which we're embarking on now.
So in reading some of the literature that y'all sent me, it strikes me that Shell wants to be considered, one of the good guys finding solutions to these big planetary challenges. But how realistic is that in the sense that, Bob Dudley, who runs BP, said during the oil spill, he said, look, the oil and gas industry is not popular in the United States. It's just not a popular industry, and that's just the reality. I mean, if Shell is a player or is an ingredient in one of these proposed solutions, won't people say, hey, I'm not so sure I want this to be the oil industry's decision? Just because, I mean, the fact that it's a suspect industry because you have so much money, you have so much power, and it's not considered to be. It's not a green industry traditionally.
I don't buy that argument because I think I hesitate to use names, but let me use one because we're working a project right now. So a group everybody knows well, EDF, Environmental Defense Fund. So now they're only going to work with us if they're absolutely convinced that we're bringing something to the table and we're sincere in what we're doing. So there's this question, this is a small piece of this bigger picture we're talking about. There's this question about natural gas development in the U.S. in terms of what sort of fugitive emissions. It's a greenhouse gas question. How much methane is escaping into the atmosphere because these natural gas resources are being developed? Well, there's been all sorts of speculation about what it really is, and some devastating numbers. So we got together with EDF and now a number of other companies and said, well, let's just start talking about it, stop talking about it in an abstract way, and let's go measure it.
Right.
So we're in the process of taking hundreds and thousands of measurements on real operations all the way across the country to answer this question factually, and then deal with it factually once we know that. So I think, people, yes, you're challenged as an oil company or, now I would say an energy company, reputationally. I understand that piece. But I think when you come to the table and you're sincere and you're working on real solutions, our experience is that it does work.
You said that y'all spend $30 billion a year in new investments. That's investments in what? How much of it? How much do y'all spend in sort of science and research into the environmental effects of things like the changing atmosphere, the acidification of the ocean? Do y'all invest in that sort of thing too?
So we don't duplicate what's being done. I mean, so let's take that example. There's so much work being done by universities and others on those two particular topics that we're happy to say we'll accept that science. Mm-hmm. And when you ask me the question about where we are on climate change and so forth, it's a simple answer for us. So, yes, it's real. Yes, we need to find ways to deal with it. We don't need to duplicate all that science. We are, if you look across the scope of energy companies, we are the highest investor in research and development. Some of that's directly towards better ways to do oil and gas. Mm-hmm. And some of that absolutely is not only our own incubation in terms of what are the new technologies and energy sources that could come through, but it's taking, and if there's venture capitalists in the room, I mean, they'll recognize this, it's taking handfuls of money and spreading it around to universities and smart minds all across the world and saying, we'd like to support you in this, and if a breakthrough's coming, we'd like to kind of know it's there, because we want to know if we can build a business out of it.
I want to go to questions pretty soon. How much time do we have? What time is it? Anyone know? 5 after 11?
We
Okay.
have about 30 minutes.
Okay. Let me, before we do, I have sort of a very broad general question about, I'd be interested in your viewpoint. Increasingly, the world is this big, complex, interconnected, global economy. We have all this technology that didn't exist 100 years ago, and you have 7 billion people. It's going to 9 billion people. You've got drilling in every sea, in every continent except maybe Antarctica. Are we collectively managing the planet as well? I mean, obviously not as well as we should, but are we capable of managing this planet using technology and good economic principles and good political ideas, or are we sort of thrashing and our way into the future? I mean, do you feel, a lot of people here, I think, are all pessimistic about the direction that we're going. I mean, after Dennis's talk yesterday morning, we're all like, oh my God, I mean, do you feel that we are on a trajectory to getting a hold of this whole problem of managing a large population on a planet that has finite resources?
So I mean, I doubt there's anybody in the room that would say we're doing anything but stumbling through it. So no, I don't think we're doing a good job of managing it now. It is the concept behind what we're talking about, though. So let me give you an example where we're trying to have an impact on that, and just sort of ignoring the challenges for a while, because if you just focus on the challenges, you never get anywhere. We talked about 9 billion people. 3/4 of those people will live in cities by the middle of the century. So this is all about smart urbanization. All the issues you raised in terms of energy, environmental impact, and what have you, in the end is going to be about, can we do urbanization in a way that dramatically changes the way we use resources and the way we waste resources. So one of these projects that we hope to embark on with a very broad group of companies cross-sector, as well as NGOs and government support, is around how do you design smart cities. Now, we'll bring the energy piece to that equation, and maybe just, other than that, maybe just some smart people to help think about it. And others will bring the other aspects And I actually do stay optimistic that you can, if you can develop a model that actually works, you already see people trying it. You see cities popping up in the Middle East.
Give me a success story. Give me a success story.
Well, I'm not sure I have a good one for you on that scale yet. But I think, there's little tiny success stories. Here's where we're trying to bridge the gap. Think of there's a small city in Western Canada called Dawson Creek. And Dawson Creek, is a growing city. There's water available, but it's reasonably scarce. They produce their water, they use it, and then they dispose of it. And now we're there in the area developing some of the natural gas resources they have. So what we've done is we've come in, we built a water treatment plant for the city. It's the city's water treatment plant. They get now a return from that water. They now use less because they get a return. We take some of that wastewater and use it in our facility so that we don't use any fresh water in our operations. And basically, you halve or more the amount of water that's wasted in an area. So there's the smallest element of what we're after. Now, if you could do that at a city scale, then you have something that I think does become interesting to governments and others, and maybe has the opportunity to be picked up in a broader sense.
How much of this is stuff that you talk about with the other people on the executive committee? There's 5 of you, right?
That run businesses around the world,
right.
Yeah.
So do y'all talk about this sort of thing when you get together? Or
No, it's exactly what we do. So I mean, let me be perfectly clear. Everybody here's probably been in a boardroom at one time or another. First couple hours is probably around how's business performance, is it doing what we expected, and so forth, and all the hard conversations around that. But when we move to our strategic segments, it is about, again, a couple of different segments in time, and one I would say is around this 2025 time period, because another 15 years, 10 years, you could start to see some things start to shift in a way that it really matters. And absolutely on this 2040, 2050 sort of time frame, when you still have a lot of optionality in terms of where you go during that time period.
Well, is there ever a conflict between short-term business needs and these long-term strategy?
Well, there's not only conflict between short-term and long-term, there's conflict between individuals on, does this really make sense? Should we really be should we really be charging ourselves $40 a ton for CO2? So yeah, there's lots of controversy in this discussion.
What's your position on that?
All the way through.
The $40 per ton.
No, I think it's exactly what we ought to be doing, because it has real impact. So let's say you're building a $10 billion facility that's going to last for 40 years. Okay. If you've taken this mindset that says CO2 is going to cost me $40 a ton, then you build it in a way that CO2 is minimized. And you build it in a way that if you have to capture it and do something with it, that you can do it. Because coming back and retrofitting 20 years from now to do that is outrageously expensive.
So you're saying that even without a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, you're already sort of factoring it in?
We are, and I think the other key message to you here, because I get this question all the time, it's all about quarterly results and everything else, and yes it is, but our investors understand exactly what we're doing here, and they accept what we're doing here. And we are still incredibly competitive. We're a very competitive company on a quarterly results basis. But so we have this sort of balanced discussion with our shareholders.
How'd you do this year so far?
We're done. We're having a good year. Yeah. I mean, it's a very competitive, good business.
What's considered a good year for Shell? I'll look it up in the. I'll look it up in the newspaper. Oh wait, they don't have those anymore.
It's all relative. So. Yeah.
So we're going to go to questions in a minute, but I have one more thing, which is, after I did this book on the BP oil spill, and it was all, obviously it was an enormously difficult time for the whole industry, but for BP. Very soon thereafter, BP cut a deal with the Russians, so didn't work out, but to try to drill in the Russian Arctic. And then I think Exxon cut that deal with them, and you know a lot more about this than I do. To what extent does it matter to this global industry that you're part of? To what extent does U.S. policy matter, or are there situations in which the U.S. is just it's just one person in this very large room? Yeah. Obviously, it's an important player, but are y'all bigger than just the U.S. And is how should we feel about the fact that we could say you can't drill in the Arctic as quickly as you would like. We're going to have a go slow policy in the Arctic. But meanwhile, it's gangbusters in Russia.
Yeah, I think Are we bigger than the U.S.? No. I mean, the U.S. plays an incredibly important role, I think, in kind of global standards and where we're going as a world. Now, I don't know that we're maximizing the use of the strength that we have there, but the U.S. and a couple of other countries around the world have incredible power and influence to do that. I think if we use the Arctic as an example, you know, when I talk to the administration about should we drill in Alaska or not, you know, about 75% of that conversation is all about can you do it and protect the environment and do it the right way. And those are deep, very difficult conversations. The other 25% is about the opportunity for the U.S. to set the standard for how Arctic development will take place if it's going to happen. And to think that you know, we as international companies and we as an enormous influential country will do this, and that the standard and the way in which we do it doesn't have influence over other countries is wrong. It does. And I know that's a challenge conceptually when you think about Russia, but it does have an impact. And I say that in a very real sense. We work in the Arctic and Russia. These standards will matter in other parts of the world.
So you're drilling in the Russian, the Siberian Arctic?
Well, we have, no, a little bit further south of that in the Sakhalin area. So we have a very large, at the time I think it was the largest energy project in the world. A very large natural gas development, but offshore, frozen water.
Do you have the same standards in each country for you know, safety?
Yeah, I think you probably picked this up in the deep water piece, and this is the model that we've taken to all aspects of our business, is we have, whether we call them operating standards or principles that say when it comes to deep water, this is the way we do it, this is the way we do it everywhere in the world. And we're not going to drop those standards somewhere just because a country's regulations are lower than that. And that's an important aspect, not only for the, you know, the confidence you have in a company, but also the understanding of there is risk in this business. If you don't perform at that level, ultimately that risk can catch up with you. So there's clear business drivers to do it.
After the Gulf spill, did Shell make any changes in its safety culture?
Well, we made a few changes. One of which is the fact that there's a pre-built now, ready to be rolled out cap and containment system that didn't exist in the industry before. So Shell and 3 other companies said, you know, 2 weeks or 3 weeks afterwards said, we're going to build this and have this on a permanent basis. And you know, I can look back on that like anybody in the room and say that should have been done, you know, long before then. But that's one of the changes that did happen. The new regulations around drilling deepwater wells in the Gulf of Mexico are amazingly similar to where Shell was before the accident took place.
What about having someone who, one of the problems with BP potentially was you had people who were making safety decisions who also were making sort of cost decisions, who were having to report like how many days this was taking, and obviously you know, these companies keep track of how expensive is this well. So you had people who were essentially had a built-in conflict of interest between safety and cost. At Shell, do you have independent lines of authority there?
Well, so independent, no, because the safety line rules. Inside of Shell, there's kind of 2 elements. One is, and this is a cultural element as much as a direct line of enforcement element, but you have to develop a culture, and this is something you have to work on every day, that says safety has to be the top priority. If you can't do it safely, then you have to stop. And easy to say, but very, very hard to do. I think one of the ways that reveals itself culturally is anybody on it. You know, a deepwater rig now probably costs $1.5 million dollars a day to operate. Right. Anybody on that platform, whether they're the caterer or the person that's running the operation, can walk over and hit the emergency shutdown button and shut down everything on that platform, which may take a week to bring back up. So it's a huge financial issue.
Okay, but
if there's something that they're uncomfortable with.
But on the Deepwater Horizon, people were reluctant to do that. I mean, there was a critical moment there. So yes, it's the rule, but does it actually happen? And after that disaster, was there a discussion about this?
Yeah, so that's why I say it's about a deep part of your culture to where you have to actually be able to rely on people to do it. So would I tell you, I think every caterer, if they smelled natural gas, would be willing to run over and hit that button right now everywhere in the Gulf of Mexico? Probably not. So it is something we continue to work on. But I will tell you that the times that it's happened, then I or somebody else flies out to that platform and pats that person on the back, even though it was done for not a valid reason. There wasn't actually a problem, but they thought there was. That's the way you sort of start to instill a culture like that. But there's, I worry about comparisons to the Macondo incident, because what I want people to do is look deeply into what our standards are for drilling these kind of wells and how we operate them. And not only is the decision-making clear, but we have a second set of eyes, and we do this on every deep water well we drill everywhere in the world. Everything that's happening on the rig can be monitored electronically on screens, just like you see around this room. You can see, it's just like sitting on the rig. And we have what we call real-time operation centers that watch every aspect with technical experts on every rig as a second set of eyes 24/7. And that's the kind of redundancy you need to make sure that in a situation like with Macondo, which didn't unfold in 3 minutes, it unfolded over, I don't know, you know better than I do, maybe 24 hours. But each one of those elements would have been picked up and seen by a completely separate set of eyes.
Let's go to questions. Is that okay?
Please.
Let me just, let's start with this gentleman right here, Mr. Coffey.
Thanks very much. In the corporate world, Shell's scenario planning has had a very high reputation, almost legendary. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that has evolved in your time there. The idea of looking out 10 and 20 and 30 years is very interesting. What factors do you bring in besides just pure energy issues? And what, have to ask, what have been the biggest hits and a blooper or two, just to keep us all amused?
Yeah. So the scenarios work is very important to us, and we'll actually come out with an update, late this year, early next year on the scenarios. And to give you a sense of what kind of things enter those and start to influence those, I think the big change you'll see this year is we had already incorporated, renewable energies and how fast those could move. We'd already incorporated climate change and CO2 emissions and so forth. One of the key elements we're incorporating now is the stress on water around the world, and that hadn't been fully incorporated before. And that will change, not only the potential outcomes here, but the choices we make along the way. I think the other, just to give you a sense of the kind of things we consider that are not just energy, we have to make political calculations as well. So on the topic of climate change, when we have a blueprint scenario which assumes there's a coordinated global, more or less, not everybody, but more or less global response to this challenge of climate change. And that presents a certain world to you where you get regulations in place, you get pricing broadly, you get certain behavior, and you see a change in outcome. Our contrary scenario that goes along with this, because scenarios are not about picking an answer, right? It's understanding what's out there and how you would deal in each of these worlds. The contrary scenario is called scramble, which is it's every country for himself, it's completely disconnected, and people are all over the place, which is pretty close to where we are right now. And that's the path we see it following. And so the good news is, I'll try to think of a blooper, but the good news is we're only a couple of years into since we've developed scramble and blueprints, but it's actually tracking pretty close to what we expected. I think I'm struggling to find one that's not energy just as I run through it, but one of the bloopers would be the amount of natural gas that exists in the world that nobody, including any of the energy companies, recognized just 5 years ago, and that changes the picture.
Let's have a question on the right side back here, in the back.
I'm Carol Carmichael at Caltech. You said that the outcome of the political election shouldn't and can't make a difference in your business. And the evidence really is borne out in the lack of political contributions of Shell and you personally. This is not evident in your competitors. And many of your competitors, I can name Exxon, Chevron, and others, not only significantly give to Republican candidates, but they're considered heavy hitters among the donors to the political action committees. Can you explain the difference and the impact that this difference has in terms of U.S. policy and maybe even their long-term corporate strategy?
Well, I think so directly to Shell, there's a couple of things about Shell that make it easier internally on this whole topic of political contributions. So you've obviously looked at the numbers, you looked at my personal numbers. I'm not a big believer in giving money to campaigns and politicians. I'm just not a big believer in that. I think it ought to be run more on the issues, and so that's just where I am personally. As a company, that's more or less the position. Now, we do have a PAC, a very small PAC, and I think in a year, we're probably talking about, less than a few tens of thousands of dollars. Looks like you know the numbers probably better than I do. And I can guarantee you that's given pretty much equally on both sides of the house. So it's around getting people to listen to what we think the issues really are, but it's a totally negligible amount of money. That's pretty easy inside the company because Royal Dutch Shell, the parent company, from a European perspective, this is more the norm. Huh? They look at the U.S. and say, why would all these businesses be contributing money to political campaigns? So it's not difficult internally. Externally, it's very challenging. So when I go to Washington or others, there's an expectation that we give, particularly according to the issues and the issues we want to see supported. Now, after saying no probably 100 times, people do eventually stop asking, which is one way to look at it. And then I think it puts us in a position which I'm pretty comfortable with, which is we can only influence by what we can factually demonstrate to be important and true. And I think about the fact that we'll be drilling in Alaska this year, absent any political contributions to speak of, and because I think we've gotten there on the facts and the science. So, yeah.
Is it on? Yeah, my name is Luis Ahoyas. I'm the executive director of the Oceanic Preservation Society. And we work with scientists, too, that are comfortable looking out 50 years, 100 years. And our information says that the burning of fossil fuels is acidifying the ocean, so that you look out to those time frames where you're trying to make money burning fossil fuels, we're going to be dissolving all the coral reefs where you have 25% of the species of the planet living. You have 1 billion people relying on it for income. And it's not, and the reefs aren't going to come back in a couple of years. It'll be millions of years. How do you reconcile your short-term interests with the long-term environmental disaster that we're creating and the economic disaster, because you're talking about billions of people, not just now, but in the future generations that aren't going to be able to survive because we're looking at your quarterly windows?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question to answer, of course, but I think from a more personal side, I think there's an element to it that says we as a company recognize, over this period of time, relatively short period of time in terms of what you were describing, that the world has a certain demand for energy, and they're basically telling us what that energy demand is and what types of energy that is as well. And so we have a role in filling that and not having the world come to a grinding halt. So there's just there's an aspect of it like that. But if you look at today's business and the fact that we understand this is hundreds and hundreds of trillions of dollars system that doesn't change overnight, and you see our drive to natural gas, and if CO2 is part of the issue, I know it's not all of the issues that you raised in those comments, but if CO2 is a major one in that, the absolute quickest way over the next 10 to 20 years that you can impact the amount of CO2 going into the air is to move to natural gas and existing power systems and moving it into transportation and so forth, as opposed to burning coal. I mean, it's just as simple as that. If you want to have an impact now, that's what you have to do. We've shifted our strategy to gas to a large degree. We're producing that gas. We actually feel pretty good about that. Is that the ultimate, 50, 60-year answer? I don't know. I mean, you could even see using natural gas if we haven't found something to substitute it in combination with carbon capture and storage and so forth, that could actually make it more of a destination fuel than just a transition fuel. But so I think we reconcile it by saying those are the kind of moves we can make and have a real impact in the near term, and that these decisions are much bigger than a company. These decisions are about government and policy and global direction.
Marvin, just to follow up, you mentioned hundreds of trillions of dollars.
Maybe bigger than that. I don't know what. I don't know what the number is.
You're referring to the infrastructure, the sort of.
Yeah, that supplies, distributes, allows things to move today. It doesn't matter what your belief is in terms of how quickly technology can develop and come into play. That's an unbelievably huge system to shift. So it doesn't mean you don't start shifting it, in a big way immediately. You just have to be realistic about
What's
what
the
it takes.
what's the fastest you could shift to a much more renewable?
Well,
Well, you mentioned 30%
Yeah.
renewables by, I think, 2050. Let's say you wanted to flip it 70% renewables by 2050. In theory, is that even possible?
Well, I mean, we do these scenarios, and the scenarios say, you know, when we put the scenario together that said you could get to 30% using of a system that's twice as big as it is today, you know, most people that understand the business looked at us and said, "You're crazy." I mean, there's no physical way that could happen, and the only way that could happen is if you had some incredible technological breakthrough that nobody's even really got an eye on yet. So do I think it could happen much faster than that? Our current best information is to get to that level by the middle of this century would be phenomenal and unlike anything the world has ever done before.
Now, you've been in the business for 30 years.
Yeah.
30 years ago, okay, today, is there something happening technologically that 30 years ago you could not have imagined? I mean, for example, the unconventional shale.
Well, I think maybe, yeah. So there are resources that are more abundant that we wouldn't have seen before. That there are cases like that. I think in terms, if I switch the question around and said, looking forward, what am I most optimistic about in terms of renewable and alternative energies? If I was sitting here last year, I wouldn't have had anything too startling to say. It's kind of the same old things. I think that, you know, I'm becoming more convinced, and doesn't have enough science behind it for my, you know, true deep belief yet, but I'm becoming more convinced that there's breakthroughs on the solar side that could be more impactful than what we've factored in so far. I think that possibility is there. I think the other possibility is that hydrogen as a fuel, which we've looked at as primarily something for several decades into the future, could be accelerated.
The gentleman in the back, left.
My name is Mike Pack. My question it's a very practical one. What is the time frame for the natural gas distribution throughout the country from a transportation aspect? And is there some sort of an integration right now going on with the automobile industry? So it would be like, when would my next car be a natural gas propelled automobile?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I'm going to take this all the way back to the stress nexus thing we were talking about, which is, so you got this big kind of chicken and egg problem, and you know, can you actually have an impact and make things happen? We've been having this discussion about natural gas into transportation for a long time now, at least 4 or 5 years in a serious way. And we decided last year that, okay, we're just going to start doing it. And so we found what we think is somewhat of a technological breakthrough, and that is the ability to do liquefied natural gas at a very small scale. So you used to have to build $10 billion plants to have the right economics around liquefied natural gas to move it around the world. Now we think we can do it at very small scale, put it in onshore locations, and have a distribution system around liquefied natural gas to run heavy transport. So we're building one now that we're going to put just outside of Calgary, and there's this 1,400 kilometer truckway that goes from Vancouver all the way to Edmonton. It's just trucks back and forth all the time. And our concept is now to start building the stations. Actually, we already have the stations. We'll fit them out for LNG and have the LNG supplied starting this year, and have the number of stations increasing over the next several years. So this is our bid to say, let's just make this stuff happen. We've done the same thing across the U.S. with Travel Centers of America. We announced as many as 200 stations in strategic points to allow the same thing to happen in the U.S.
This gentleman over here.
I'm David McConville with the Buckminster Fuller Institute. It's great to hear that you're incorporating some more systemic views around food and water. And I'm curious, in terms of the scenario planning and the work that you're doing, are you aware if you're incorporating any of the other boundaries? For instance, there's a framework called the planetary boundaries that's looking at land use, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, all of these things. Do you know if your scenario group is looking at any of that? And also, are they looking at, with regards to the kind of legal personhood aspects of corporations in America, the rights versus the responsibilities of that within a legal setting, and how that might restrict Shell from doing some of the things that they want to do internally, but they might be legally obligated to kind of maximize short-term profits as opposed to looking out a longer term. And it seems like those two dynamics could really be significant in terms of your scenario development capacity.
Yeah, I think to to an element that you mentioned, it'd be hard for me to answer explicitly, but generally, yes. So several of those aspects, and they come in two forms at least. One is that I mentioned these sort of endpoint scenarios of scrambles and blueprint. You know, I talked about it around CO2, but there's a lot of other elements that are in that range. And then we have this kind of broader set that don't get a lot of discussion in the way we publish it, but are part of those considerations, which are limitations that just come from the natural environment and so forth, and disaster scenarios and what have you. But most of it, I'll be frank, you know, most of it is driven in the end by then assumptions around, assume this problem is real, how will governments react, how will that allow us to act, and then that's the kind of policy decision and format we build into these scenarios. But we do try to take all of that into account.
Gentleman right here in front. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Larry, hi. My question is on carbon capture. What can you do with it when you capture it? Can it be turned into money or a benefit for somebody?
Yeah. Yeah, those are all the questions we're working through right now. There are a couple of things you can do right now. So the project that we're working in Canada that captures CO2 coming off this operation, if you think in these terms, it's about 1 million tons per annum of CO2. And the idea is that we will actually compress it to a liquid state, and we will put it in deep reservoirs into the earth. Just like oil and gas sits down there now, we'll put the CO2 down into those reservoirs, and then that's where it sits for geologic time. That's carbon capture and storage. That's that's the existing technology, but it's very, very expensive. And the question in front of us is, can we do enough demonstration projects with that technology to bring the cost down so that that becomes part of the solution? And the idea for us is that, you know, it's like a lot of things. There is no single solution for CO2 or any of the other challenges we're dealing with, but that's potentially one of them. So we're working to make that real.
Does it really work, Marvin?
Yeah, it really works.
I mean,
But what do you mean with your question?
You can capture the carbon,
Yeah.
liquefy it, and pump it down into the ground, and it'll stay down there for geologic time. I mean, that technology really does work.
Yeah. So let me throw out a piece of irony for you.
Okay.
There's I think going back to Shelby probably knows, probably going back to the 70s or so, maybe earlier, there was a way, once you took all the oil out of a reservoir, there was a way to get more oil out of it by putting CO2 into the ground. That makes the oil easier to move, and you'd push that through the reservoir and you'd produce more oil. So we went out and drilled to find reservoirs deep in the ground that had pure CO2 in them, and we produced that pure CO2. And then piped it from Colorado all the way down to Texas to put it into other reservoirs. So the idea of CO2 geologically, permanently in a reservoir, in a liquid state, is what Mother Nature did. We're basically mimicking that. So yeah, it works.
Okay, we're about out of time. I think we have time for one more question. Who has a question? How about this gentleman in blue in the back?
Hello, my name is Jiří Suchanek, and I came up to Aspen from Czech Republic, and I work for a hard coal mining company. And I have a question. We did one research recently, since we do lots of CSR activities as you do, but not in that amount. And what the research said, that we can have arguments, as you said here, rational arguments to the professionals. And they might agree or disagree. But the wide public, they consider all the commodities as they belong to them, not to the government, not even to the company. So it's something that you're touching their emotional side of the thinking, and they will never accept it. So the result is that we and you can do how much we can, but people still will never like you. So I didn't mean you, I mean like company.
No,
so
don't take it personally.
No,
yeah, please. So
I did that a long time ago. Yeah.
So would you agree on that? And you're still doing your best in terms of sustainability?
Yeah, so we will, I think we'll do exactly really what you said, which is there will be boundaries on what we can do. And I would never sit up here and say, you know, we can go down this path of environmental altruism that doesn't work for our shareholders because we can't. But our shareholders, we find, are pretty smart in terms of understanding what we should be doing to prepare for the future and to be the right kind of company that has the license to operate in areas around the world, because there's a lot of opposition to this type of development as well. And I'd come back to Alaska as an example of that. I don't think we could get there without being the right kind of company to do it. So we'll have those boundaries out there. We'll operate within those boundaries to a degree. But I think I'm a little more optimistic than you are. I think minds shift over time, and there'll be plenty of space to move.
Well, thank you guys for coming. I enjoyed it. Thanks for being here. Marvin, thanks so much.
Thanks, Joel.